when you live in a little country town out of the way, you and all your neighbors learn to do an awful lot of things for yourselves, and you come to be very independent of as much outside help as is possible, because you just can't always pick up a phone and call somebody for help. You just got to do it your own self. So lots of times folks will just get real good at doing one thing or another, and they sort of specialize in that field. And that's the way it was with Chicken Watson. Chicken was the closest thing we had to a veterinary in our part of Long County, Georgia. He was called on all the time to fix up sick animals, and Chicken specialized in sick mules. I guess he knew more about sick mules than anybody that ever lived. We had a couple that lived there named Glenn and Clara Purdy. And Glenn was a seaman, and he'd be gone sometimes 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time. He shipped out of the port of Jacksonville, Florida, second-class seaman. And one summer, when Glenn was off on a trip somewhere, one of his most prized mules got out in the onion grass and sour weeds and just had himself a feast. He swole up like a balloon. He was moaning and snorting. He's in pain, all bloated up real bad. And if you know anything about animals, you know that if when they get in that shape, you don't get them some relief pretty soon, they're going to die. Well, Clara come home from shopping in Ludowici, and that mule was in bad shape. He was down bad. Clara knew if that mule died, that she just better get shut of town, because Glenn had fixed her clock. Glenn had raised more hell than 26 preachers at a Baptist prayer meeting. She went running out there. That mule was groaning and moaning. She opened up that barnyard gate and run in there, looked him all over, run around him in a circle a couple times. She balled up her little fist, and she hauled off and punched him in the side just as hard as she could, and run over and jumped up on the fence and sat there. And nothing happened, so she come running back, and she balled up her little fist, and she give him another shot and run sit up on that fence. And the reason she was running to get up on that fence is because you don't want to be nowhere near a bad down mule if that gas pops loose. Now, you may think a paper mill smells bad or some of that Los Angeles fog, but you don't want to be anywhere in the same county with a mule if that gas pops loose. Anyway, she hit him, and she'd run and jump on the fence, and nothing happened except that mule got madder and sicker and furiouser. And Clara was in a panic. That mule was hurting. And Glenn was going to put the hurt on her if anything happened to that mule. She ran across the road where some folks had a telephone, and she called down the feed and hardware store looking for Chicken Watson, and he was there. He worked around there sometimes, and she got him on the phone, and she hollered at him, told him what the matter was, and he sort of tried to calm her down. Now, Clara's about half deaf, and she was shouting in one end of the line about what was the matter, and Chicken was shouting in the other end of the line, and that mule was moaning and braying and snorting out there, and things were going from bad to worse. And finally Chicken shouted, said, "Damn it, Clara, now shut up and let me tell you what to do." Clara was sniffling and crying and listening the best she could, and she shut up long enough for Chicken to tell her, and he told her, said, "You go out to the barn and you get 1.5 cups of turpentine, 3 cups of sorghum molasses, and 3 cups of that old sour dandelion wine that Glenn keeps out there, and you put it in one of them small crocks, and you mix it up real good, take it in the house, add about 1/2 knock of baking soda, put it in a pot, and bring it to 1/2 boil. You take it out there, and you pour it in that mule, and you wait 5 minutes, and then you go over there, and you kick him in the belly, right behind the ribs, as hard as you can, and you run like hell and get up on that fence." Clara said, "Chicken, I ain't about to pour that down that mule's throat. Now, I know Glenn is going to hurt me bad, but I'd rather have that happen than to lose 4 of my fingers from that mule chewing on it." Chicken said, "Clara, you ain't going to lose no fingers." Said, "You go out to the barn, and you get that planting bugle, and you run it down that mule's throat and pour it down in there." You know what a planting bugle is? A planting bugle is a long brass tube about 3.5 feet long, and it's got a bell on one end. It looks like one of them horns they blow in them old-timey movies when them knights come and go knock each other off their horses. It looks like, you know, them Robin Hood horns. And you use it, you hold it in your left hand, and you put that sack of corn or seed on your shoulder, and you hunch that seed, and them seed will go down in that bell, and they come out 1 or 2 at a time, and it spaces your crop. It's a planting bugle. It's got a flared in, sort of a funnel at one end. And when I was a kid, you could take that bugle, and the folks, the mamas and daddies around Long County, if you held your mouth just right and blew on it hard enough, you could get a blasting sound that you could hear for 1.5 miles. And in the late afternoon, you'd hear them planting bugles going off all over Long County, Georgia, folks calling the kids home for supper. Well, Clara run back across the road, She found the bugle, she got the crock, but like I told you, she's about half deaf, and she got the measurements all mixed up. She put in 3 cups of turpentine. She put a cup and a half each of sorghum molasses and green persimmon wine, and instead of a half a knock, which is when you knock a box of powder on the side of a pot, you just bump it easy and a little bit comes out. That's a half a knock. Instead of a half a knock, she put in a half a box of baking soda. And she put it on the stove and she brought it to a half a boil, which is when them little bitty bubbles start coming up out of the bottom of the pot. And she grabbed that pan, got that bugle, and she run out in the yard. By the time she got there, that mule was in bad shape. He was dying. She had that pot in one hand and that planting bugle in the other. And she's crying and scared and excited, and that mule was down on his front knees with his forehead right flat on the ground. And she run around him in a circle trying to figure out how she's going to get his head up to get that bugle down his throat with his forehead flat on the ground, and she knew there wasn't no way to get it in there, so she just run around behind him and picked up his tail and drove it home. And she'd jiggle that bugle a couple of times, and she'd pour that juice and jiggle that bugle and pour that juice and jiggle that bugle and pour that juice, and finally got all of him. And she ran up and got on the fence, and she was sitting there, and she counted to 300 real slow. She got off that fence, she run over there and took her foot, and she like to punted that mule halfway out of the barnyard. She give him a shot, and she run back and got on the fence, and she hadn't no more got there than that mule just kind of levitated up off the ground. He just come up. That juice hit ground. It hit bottom. Them weeds that was causing that blockage just kind of dissolved. He jumped right straight up on the air. He let fly with that planting bugle. Boom! And he was gone down the road. Well, Clara had forgot to shut the barnyard gate. He went out that gate like he was on fire, hit that state road, made a right turn, and went down toward Big Will's Creek, and about every 10 steps he was letting fly with a blast on that planting bugle. Boom! Sound like an air horn. Well, now, Big Will's Creek is about 100 feet wide. And the mill had built one of them old hand-pulled barges to get the log trucks from one side of the creek to the other side of the creek. And they'd hired this old boy named Dude Barnes to stand there and pull them trucks back and forth across the creek. And Dude stayed in the little house right there on the bank of the creek, and when he'd hear one of them air horns, why, he'd go out there and he'd pull that old barge. He'd pull that old ferry over to whatever side of the creek he heard that horn blowing on. Well, it was late on a Saturday afternoon, and he was about half squashed on that old pop skull whiskey, and it was hot, and he'd been sitting there in that old house, and he heard that bugle blowing. Boom! He run out there, and he started tugging on that barge, see? He was going to get it over there where that truck was coming, he thought. Well, meantime, there's a log truck coming in the other direction. And old Dude just kept coming, and that truck would blow his air horn, boom, out, and that bugle would blow from that mule, boom, out, and old Dude just kept tugging, getting that ferry over to the other side of the creek. That truck come around that curve and whoop, right into Big Will's Creek, because the barge was gone. About that time, Dude hit the other side of the creek, and here come that mule. He run right out to the end of that barge. He let fly with a blast on that bugle, and he took one jump, landed on his knees on the other side of the creek, stood right straight up, boom, and he was gone. We ain't never seen that mule again. Gone to Texas. Well, that log truck was underwater, and old Dude was just standing there with his mouth open, watching everything go on. And he got that truck driver out of that truck. Truck was a total loss. And old Dude and that truck driver is walking down the road cussing at each other. Glenn and Clara Purdy got a divorce. Ain't never seen that mule again. Truck driver got fired. And old Dude got fired too, because they figured any man that didn't know the difference between a log truck and a mule with a bugle up his butt didn't need to be running no ferry boat anyway.